Hey everyone, welcome to Two Guys Making Tribe, where Gen X meets Gen Y. Enjoy the show.
And we are live. Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into today's show. We are recording on Wednesday, April 16th, 2025. Tonight, we have a very special guest, co-host who is filling in for Brendan. Since Brendan is once again deployed with Grindstone Ministries, this time Grindstone is helping folks in Selmer, Tennessee recover from the recent tornadoes. Mother Nature is keeping Grindstone busy this year with tornadoes, and we are only in April. In a few more months, we will be heading into hurricane season, and early estimates are predicting a more active season this year versus last year. So I'll be tracking that over the next few months, and we will chat about that in future episodes. But now, please welcome Aaron, a.k.a. the Bearded Tribalist, to the show. Aaron, thanks for filling in for Brendan, and let's start off with you sharing some things about yourself. The mic is yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Dominic. So I've been involved in prepping or the prepping movement for probably about 15, 16 years now. I watched it kind of start out and develop right alongside the Tea Party movement. And I've been interested in this collection of subjects my whole life. Always been big into self-reliance. I love doing bushcraft. I was a missionary growing up. Went to Mexico, Belize, Argentina, Spain, Morocco, Israel, just kind of all over the place. Got to see how people lived in very austere environments. Was pretty fascinated by the things that humans can survive. So gone through and, I didn't know there was a name for my collection of hobbies. And it was prepping. So I've, like I said, I've been enjoying it ever since. I've helped set up a couple of groups for building skill sets for people. Stuff that I kind of took for granted growing up, like how to throw a cast net, or how to run a trot line, or hunting. Just starting to teach people how to do that. But also, getting into some softer skill sets like group design and intentionally building culture and everything. So that's me in a nutshell, I guess.
Yeah, that's awesome. There's so much emphasis in this genre about buying gear and stacking food and what have you, and not as much into the skill building and developing community.
Yeah.
Not just in our local areas, but in other areas, because I've traveled internationally as well, and people live quite differently than we do. Sometimes with less of one thing, more of another, slower paces in a lot of aspects, and it's quite an experience to go and travel overseas to interact with people just as a tourist, let alone as a missionary. So, and usually if you're doing missionary work, you're in an area that is basically grid down for the most part,
Yeah. A bunch of the stuff that I did over in Mexico was over in the Yucatan Peninsula, and it was quite a poor area since they weren't really on any kind of big coke routes. Didn't have a lot of industry. One of the most common things that we'd find in the rural villages was people would gather firewood, and that would make their household income if mommy and daddy and all the little strap hangers that they had would go out there and gather it. They'd make about $2 US a month.
Wow.
So you'd see mama would come out of her little mud hut with a thatch roof and be wearing a shirt, usually no bottoms, hopefully it covered anything interesting. And you'd see kids running around. They have their big stomachs out because of parasites, things like giardia. And it was a little bit of a culture shock, but learning about running the jungles with them, it was interesting. Like you'd see the men, every man would have a machete on him at all times. So they're a bladed culture, and they do freaking everything with that machete. So
it's the multi-purpose tool. It's their multi-tool, basically.
I've seen them use it for everything from edging a garden to cutting pineapples to solving arguments.
Yeah.
It tends to be pretty conclusive when you bring up the machete. So
It's kind of like the old West.
mm-hmm.
Everyone's carrying, and if you're going to be brave, it has consequences.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we had a driver. I remember on one of my trips to Belize, and his nickname was Spooky. I don't remember the guy's real name because I probably did this trip about 22 years ago. I was 16 at the time, and he had his thumb was actually grafted onto about this part of his forearm.
Oh, wow.
And it was because he had gotten into an argument with somebody when he was a kid, and he held up his hands in front of his head because the person didn't like what he was saying, and he got tuned up pretty bad. So he had defensive wounds. His hands were all hacked up and stuff. But he was our bus driver. And he would take his little nubbin thumb and put his forearm up on the wheel, and he would grip the wheel that way and be able to turn it and drive like this. So,
well, it's been very fascinating to me to see injuries. I mean, it's unfortunate that he suffered these injuries, but in one sense, it gives me hope because these things happen in areas where they don't have the medical systems that we do and access to medical supplies and antibiotics and what have you. And so many people are able to I wouldn't say come back, but survive these and somewhat function.
Yeah.
So I've always been curious of how can they do that in those kind of environments?
Well, you don't really have a choice, right? It's not like, I remember talking with one of the hunters down in Mexico, and I asked him what he liked to hunt. And he said, he looked at me like I was an idiot. Because, when we go hunting over here, it's I'm going out for deer, or I've got a turkey tag or something like that.
Yeah.
For him, it was, he was like, meat. I'm hunting because I'm going out there, and if I see an animal, I'm going to kill it, and then I'm going to bring it back. And if I don't see an animal, then everybody's hungry tonight.
Yeah.
So,
definitely not for sport.
I was like, so you don't really care about whether it's a tapir or a monkey or a deer or anything like that. He's like, no, it's just if it's slower than me or a bullet, it's going in the pot.
Yeah. That keeps it real right there. Well, when you go into these environments, you always hear about dysentery and just all these waterborne type of things. Do you guys go in? Is that like your go-to project? Say, water systems?
So usually we'd start out like in the Yucatan. We'd find the headman in the village and teach him how to maintain a chainsaw, and then give him a chainsaw. That would up his money to about $20 a month. So he's essentially adding another 10 households worth of gross production to the community, and that would usually start a bit of a waterfall effect, because now he's spending money, and it's like he's not doing the whole like hipster buy local thing. He just doesn't have a choice. But then we teach them about stuff like sanitation. A lot of them are very unaware of stuff like germ theory. I've dealt with some of the more rural villages where, hey, don't crap in your drinking water. Don't let your animals crap in your drinking water. And they grow up drinking it, and it's normal to them. And
because their body's adapted.
Yeah. How many how many kids are you losing for every one that you successfully carry to term? What's the age of an average mother in this, and how many of them are making it through the childbearing years?
Yeah.
So teaching them little things like that, it's kind of it helps a lot. And then getting them clean water is usually the next one. And then while you're doing all the humanitarian stuff, they'll listen to, or they would listen to, like, the Jesus message that we were bringing at the time. So, you feed somebody's family, and he'll sit through whatever you want to tell him.
Yeah.
Just to be polite. But it's hard to preach at people who have a hungry belly. So
Yeah.
you gotta you definitely got to take that into account as well.
Yeah. Well, I've always wondered why people, go to the restroom in the water in these places. I can understand that's where they're going to bathe and the animals bathe in there. But it's like, I try to think of it from their lens. Okay. So is it safer to do it in the water, or is it, hey, well, I don't have any toilet because they don't use toilet paper, I mean, why do it?
Oh, they kind of just go wherever they are when they're, when they
At
feel
that
the
moment.
need. Yeah. It's like, in Western culture, we have bathrooms.
Yeah.
But, if you're out in the field working, growing crops that day and you find a sudden need, a lot of them will just squat right over there. I've seen some of my friends that are from, or that have done business trips in India. And they talk a lot about those guys are just, they'll squat right in the middle of the street. And then they don't use toilet paper. And like the River Ganges is one of the nastiest rivers in the world. You literally see bodies floating in it. So it's, understanding that and then teaching them a little bit of germ theory and how to, prevent infection. That's a huge killer right up there behind clean water. So, it's just little things that we take for granted. I learned about Pasteur's theory of germ theory when I was in middle school, I want to say. Maybe like third or fourth grade, something like that.
Yeah.
And, they've never had that explained to them.
Yeah. I remember seeing it. Either I read somewhere or saw it in a documentary or a show. And I don't know which war it was. Maybe it was the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
Hygiene, and cleaning tools, the instruments. And it just kind of reflected on me. There's usually, it seems like in wars, more people die from that are injuries that are not wound. They're not like from being shot or chopped.
Yeah.
So like in World War I, you had, all that frontline, just trench warfare going on and devastated, both sides. But then the bulk of the people died from the Spanish flu.
Mm-hmm.
And then the U.S. rolled up at the end of the war and kind of mopped up. And it seems like they're, in previous wars, it's from hunger or, exposure, to the elements. And
secondary infection after injuries and all kinds of stuff. I mean, World War I was interesting because a lot of the guys would have trench foot. And
sitting in the water all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and you don't take off your shoes for 20 days at a time. There's nowhere to dry out completely. So you just get this waterlogged appearance. And oh, by the way, you're not really sleeping in, a dry environment because you can't elevate yourself out of the mud because that's, the guy who's sticking up or sitting up is, he's probably going to get shot. So, regardless of if it kills you or not, that still makes you combat ineffective.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was in the Army, like our sergeants were maniacal about foot care.
Yeah.
If you didn't have a change of socks on you, like they would smoke you bad. That was your weekend's planned now, because you're trying to let the whole team down.
Yeah, that was drilled into us too when I was in the Marines. I mean, the rest of your clothes could be dirty and stink as the high heaven, but you had to swap them socks. And I remember was at boot camp. We were doing BWT, basic warrior training. We're out in the field for like 10 days. I mean, we're basically eating MREs every day. We had one hot meal, I think, that got brought out. But, I mean, we're just sleeping in our clothes and just other than swapping socks, that's about it. And they offered us a field shower, I think, the night before we marched back. Now, this is like November. It's cold out. This is in South Carolina over at Parris Island. And we're like, no, we're good. We'll wait until – and it's basically a big water tower with a pull chain.
Yeah.
And no, we're good. We'll wait till we come back. And you didn't realize how dirty and stanky you were until you went back to the main receiving area where everyone lived, and you're seeing guys that are fresh off the bus, people that are in first phase with crisp uniforms, and we're like Pigpen.
Yep.
And man, it was something else. But after that, when people complain about stuff, I'm like, you guys have no idea. Now, this is nothing compared to my friends that deployed, to Iraq and Afghanistan. So, I had a good compared to them, but man, regular civilians, you just don't even know.
Yeah. Well, you learn what it really takes to survive, and it's surprisingly little. But just because you're surviving doesn't mean you're comfortable. Doesn't mean
Right.
you're happy. I've always said when I'm teaching or doing consulting or whatever, talking about this group of subjects, I tell everybody, I'm like, hey man, I don't want to survive. I want to thrive.
Yeah.
I want to do well enough that I'm actually, able to have a reason to keep on living.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
it makes a huge difference.
I think a lot of that gets lost on people in this space, and which brings us to our segue. Okay,
Yeah.
because a lot of people in our space, they've got their ideas or the fantasy of it all from prepper fiction. And that's the next topic within our series of preparedness ecosystem that we're doing a series of episodes on. What was your first exposure to prepper fiction?
Like we had been talking about before, before we started filming, I grew up reading a lot of classic books, classic literature. We had a fairly developed standard for my house when I was growing up. If it wasn't Christian, then it wasn't in there. So I didn't read a lot of contemporary stuff, didn't watch a lot of contemporary shows, but I did read Swiss Family Robinson. And I mean, they're dealing with all the problems that we have as preppers. They get shipwrecked.
Yep.
And the first thing that they have to do is, they go onto this island and they have to make a camp, and then they have to, salvage their ship, and they've got to make it. Robinson Crusoe was the same way. Although it's probably one of the movies that will never get, or books that will never get made into a movie in modern times, because it's a little bit non-PC with His Guy Friday. But I was always outside as a kid, so books like My Side of the Mountain also appealed to me, and it was interesting because those books, those three that I just mentioned, Swiss Family Robinson, Robinson Crusoe, and My Side of the Mountain, there's a certain level of hope that's really odd when you put it up against a lot of prepper fiction, because you look at 1 second afterward or after, or the book Patriots, which was kind of like when I was first getting into this. Rawls had just written that fairly recently, and it was almost like gang signs. Have you read Patriots? Do you know about what they talk
No,
about?
but I know it's been it
Well,
is.
I mean, that's
It's
what people
kind
would
of all
ask you.
based on.
Yeah. So, that hopelessness and people, really struggling, the modern person that struggles once his convenience is taken away, put up against somebody who's like Robinson Crusoe, and I mean, he's going to be lonely, and he's going to continue living, but he doesn't spend a lot of time like bemoaning his fate, all the bad things that have happened to him. He just goes, oh well, I guess I'm gonna have to rebuild my own little civilization if I'm not, traveling to somebody else's. And he does. And that's that sense of hope and that sense of never giving up and kind of that frontier and pioneering spirit. That's something that really really impacted me as a kid and as a young man.
Well, my first experience was not as your modern day prepper fiction, but was Little House on the Prairie. And it had some of the key points that I think are very important to the preparedness community today. Obviously it was out in the frontier, so you're in austere environments. They're building a life from the ground. It's about family, everybody contributing. It's about community. There was a lot of seasons, and I grew up watching that as a kid, and even introduced it to my children when they were a little bit younger. Now I know that show was based on a series of books, Laura Ingalls Wilder, and kind of gave a different variation of the family struggle. And I think it had the right combination of family, community, and hope and perseverance. I think those are important aspects in preparedness, where a lot of the thought process for some people is like me and mines and lone wolf preppers. I'm just going to look out for me, or I'm just going to look out for me and my immediate house and just wait out whatever is going to happen. And that might work for a little while. It might work out for some, but mostly it's not, because the world it's a fantasy, and the world is, a more dynamic place than what that fantasy will allow to play out. With the modern prepper fiction, probably I'd say my favorite is probably the Going Home series. Angry American is his pen name, but Chris Weatherman is the author. That's probably one of the, if not most popular series of books. And a lot of them have common themes. That series, there's a big EMP, and it takes out all the electronics and cars and what have you. And the main character is in Tallahassee, and he's a prepper, and he's got all kinds of gear in his car and stuff like that. And he's got to get back to, was it Tavares? It's more gets back to Lake County. I can't remember the exact city. Yeah. Near Eustis. And which I think Chris Weatherman grew up in that area. So, which is another thing of why I like the series, because it's based out of Florida. So it's easier for me to envision it. And at one point I was like, man, it'd be pretty cool to go sit there and take a tour of all the places in the book, because there's 10 or 11 books so far, but the vast majority of the book, have you read it? The series?
No, I haven't read the series yet. I'll probably give it a read, though. It sounds I've had a couple of people recommend it to me.
Yeah. I've read it, and some of the books I did on audio, but I read all the books. I have all the physical books here and stuff. I'll have to lend you some of those books next time I see you. Yeah. But basically, there's a lot of stuff in it. It talks about his journey, and then the journey of some of the other characters, which is atypical for a lot of different fiction series. But that was probably the one series that had the most examples of how to do things, and how to forage for food, and get the heart of palm, and get these things out of the rivers. I forget what they're called. Now, it's not something you could feed masses of people on, but it was really cool and interesting that, all this stuff is in Florida. It's all real. And the Native American populations that were here before we got here were doing all these things. And that's, how he had learned it, from researching them. Of course, it has another common thing, which just happens to connect with a soft team, special operators, special forces, that comes in handy in the apocalypse. But the character development was really great, all kinds of different personalities and stuff like that. It feeds a lot of different audiences, Yeah. So if you like the military guys and you like them blowing up stuff, and, but then you also like the moral fortitude of somebody and try to do something right and be just and not be just, marauding and pillaging people. So I think it's a great series to dive into to see a lot of that stuff.
I've always been amazed at how many people in this community will talk about, that their plan is basically to become a marauder. Dude, so you're telling me that you're going to be one of the gremlins that I'm going to have to deal with? And
yeah,
they lack the self-awareness to also understand that, hey, you're telling me that during peacetime. How do you think I'm going to treat you if we meet after after a crisis event? You think I'm going to wait for you to come knocking at my door so that you can, decide how much of my food I get to keep? Or do you think I'm just going to kind of tidy up my environment and make sure that you don't bother my wife or my daughter?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing is, I agree with you on that with the marauders, and people say, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to come get your stuff, or whatever. And if you think about who are the most dangerous people going to be in that kind of a situation, and for me, one of them would be the guy that can rile somebody up, that can sell, people that are desperate and just are full of emotion. You get some guy that can come in there and he's like a cult of personality and gets all people riled up. And then, there's a place over there. Let's just go get all that stuff. And those are the guys that catch bullets or catch the machete, so to speak. And he's behind, telling everybody, look what they did to our people. We need to go back and take everything they got now. They could have just gave us a little. They couldn't give us anything. No one's got to give you anything. But people that are desperate, and people are, just like they say, children crave structure. Okay? Adults crave leadership. Okay?
Yep.
But leadership is different than a boss or a manager or dictator. So a leader inspires people to do something, in my opinion, that is good, that is benevolent. Okay? You got some guy that is a manipulator, that's a boss. And he's the one that can get people to do all kinds of stuff that's not in their best interest, but they're for his benefit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've looked at a lot of that, and I remember when I was in my brief foray into corporate life, it always astounded me how few leaders we'd see in there, but we did see a lot of managers.
Yeah.
And one of my first bosses in corporate life was a guy named Bill, and he was an early mentor for me. And he explained to me one time, he's like, leaders build teams, and they grow those under them so that they can continue to achieve personal growth, and their skills get better, and that may mean that they end up leaving at some point, if they've outgrown their environment or there's not room for growth there. But he said, that's okay with a leader, because it's more about the team that he's building. Managers just build systems.
Yeah.
And everything's replaceable. And the idea is that a manager, is just going to build something that it treats people like a resource, and you're spent intentionally. I was in staffing, and that whole industry is a huge, super high burnout rate. Towards the end of my time at that particular company, I was working about 110 hours a week, and they had me replaced before when I put in my 2 weeks notice. They had me replaced before the ink was dry on the paper. It's
another variation of sales.
Yeah. But it's interesting, because they'd look at it and they were like, hey, we know that the guy that builds this market is probably not going to be the guy that benefits from all the stuff that he built out, because he's going to be so burnt out because of all the hard work it takes.
Yeah.
So they're like, it's a good book of business, but know that you really only have about 2 years here, and then you're either going to find a better offer, or you're just going to burn out.
Yeah. So true.
It was so funny. I mean, everybody was replaceable. I mean, the CEO used to tell us that all the time. Everybody's replaceable, even me. So,
the machine keeps moving.
Yep.
Another series that I liked was The Borrowed World. And that was authored by Franklin Horton. And that's based out of the Virginia area. I believe that's where he grew up. And that has almost as many books as Going Home. And plus there's also spin-off series or other, genres within the genre. And ironically, a lot of these authors, they're friends and they've mentored. So Chris Weatherman, I know he's friends with Franklin Horton. He may have mentored him. And then there's Pete Robert Tucci. I just finished his 3 books. And that was the Eden Army. There was 3 of them. I did that on audiobook. And I know he's been on Chris Weatherman's podcast. And I know Franklin Horton, if I'm correct, Franklin Horton and Chris both mentored Pete. And Pete used to live in Florida, I believe. I don't know if he still does, but I think he moved away. But it's a small community. And, I think it's really good that these guys help each other. There was similarities in his books in the Eden Army to the Going Home series. Of course, there was another special forces team, and with a grouchy leader, just like in Going Home. But it's okay, because at first I was like, man, that's kind of similar. But then I'm like, well, you know what? He mentored him, and if you love this series, you're going to be more open to this over here. I mean, how many different ways can you spin this genre? It's
Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting because, what are they? What position are they writing from? That's
right.
One of the reasons why, the trope of the random special forces team that you're just suddenly going to come across, who's going to help you, or the, what was your big crisis? Was it an EMP? Was it a plague? Nuclear war?
Yeah.
I remember back seeing some of the old. At that time they were called survivalists, fiction from the 70s. Looking at that, everybody was so scared about nuclear war, and everybody remembered the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I remember my mom being told while she was in school, during that she had to get down under her desk. But she's like, I don't understand why they made us do this as a drill, because I don't think they really thought that one through. Okay, you're gonna get hit by a nuclear bomb, but man, as long as you get underneath that desk, that's gonna save you.
To me, I think most of that was just psychological. I sit there and I try to think about what's the practicality of it. Well, if it's far enough away that it doesn't incinerate you, but it's close enough that the sonic boom or the heat wave blows the windows, it'll keep them getting some shrapnel. Maybe that's about it.
Maybe, but then you've got nuclear fallout issues that you're going to have to deal with for aftermath. You're going to be so glad you survived when all of your hair starts falling out and your skin starts sloughing off of you.
Yeah. Well, there's another. God, I wanted to talk to you about this one other book that I couldn't even finish reading. Okay, I'm gonna look at my library right here, and it wasn't because it was bad per se. Oh man. Let's see here. Man, I'll have to find it. Something to do with Days of Wrath. I believe that's what it's called. So the reason I bring up that book is because for me, I think I have a pretty good tolerance when it comes to, death and destruction in fiction. I love apocalypse, everything. But this hit so close to home for me where it was different than other books. So, and it touched base with, so there's plausibility and probability, okay? So people, I think they're really fearful of EMPs, okay? And nuclear war is probably second, okay? To me, both of those are plausible, but not as probable as cyber attacks and terrorism, or a combination of those two, to take down infrastructure and to shut everything down. Okay. But it added a component, because those things were there in that book, but it also added a component where the terrorist teams went to middle schools. My children happened to be in middle schools. And they did some very horrific things. Okay. And as you're watching, I'm reading as this, listening actually, because I was doing an audiobook, listening to it roll out. I mean, I just kept getting angrier and angrier and angrier. And it was physically bothering me. I had to literally stop reading the book.
Yeah.
And some people maybe not have that problem, but I don't feel like I'm, pretty soft or anything about it, but it's just like, I just kept envisioning this happening at my kid's school, and it just made me want to act. And I was like, oh, this is driving me crazy. I can't, this is fiction, and I can't do anything about this right now. And then it just reminded me that, at most schools in Florida, there's one sheriff or one, TPD.
Yeah.
Okay. And
usually it's not the guy who's in the most physical shape, or that's somebody typically on their way out of their career. They have that Dunlap disease that a lot of us catch over the years. Or that belly Dunlapped over the belt.
Yes.
And it's
too common. And
and
I know probably more than the average person when it comes to the vulnerabilities of schools. Okay. And it's just, it exponentially made it worse for me. I felt helpless. And so I had to put that book down, but it still resonates in my brain, and it made me dig a little deeper. And, if something ever happened, how I would react. I mean, but any parent, what are you going to do at that point? It is, everyone's helpless when those tragedies happen. And you just got to pray that it doesn't happen again, let alone to your own family,
Well, I remember reading, there's a really good book called Terror at Beslan. And it's a guy, I forget the author's name. I know he's designed a bunch of knives for CRKT, if it's the guy I'm thinking of. But he went to Beslan in Russia after it was taken over by the terrorists, the Chechens. Yeah, so they invaded that school, and then they put up booby traps, and they hunted, they kind of barricaded themselves in, and they were shooting people and making all these demands and everything. But I remember the one of the things that really stood out to me was he was talking about listening to a audio clip of a sniper, and there's a little, maybe 6 or 9 years old, because that they specifically did it on a Russian tradition that they have, where it's like during the first day of school, the whole family shows up. So you want to meet the teacher and everything, and so you're going to have an entire bloodline there, because they're very, that's very community oriented, right? You don't, if you have a problem with a kid, you know exactly who to call. You've met dad and grandpa and mom. And he said that this little girl, she was either 6 or 9 years old, and she climbed out one of the windows after the fire had started in the school, when they were taking the school back. And this police sniper is begging from higher up to be authorized to shoot her in the leg so she wouldn't go back in the building. And she ended up, she was crying out, "Mommy, mommy," and she climbed back into the flames to go try to find her mom. And it makes, you were talking about who's the most dangerous person in the aftermath. I think people that have had experiences like that, or a man who is had to tell his family that nothing is for dinner for the third day in a row. As a father yourself, there's not a lot of functional limits that we have when it comes to taking care of our kids and things we won't do. I try to be as honorable and ethical and moral as possible. But there's definitely a hierarchy of priorities, and my daughter sits right at the top of it.
Yeah,
So,
it really puts a lot of pressure on our moral baseline.
Yep.
And it'll impact everybody.
Yeah.
And,
well, that's one of the interesting things to me, because what happened after Beslan too was a lot of the guys that were Spetsnaz. They have different Spetsnaz groups that are anti-terrorist, but they're also attached to like some police and military and stuff. They tracked down every one of those terrorists, everybody who supported them and helped plan that raid, and they mailed pieces of them to affected parties. And I was like, I hope it hurt when they were taking the pieces.
Yeah.
Couldn't happen to a nicer crew.
Yeah. And some people might be offended by that occurring. And to me, it's just like, when these tragedies occur, okay, in one sense, it's not going to bring back anyone that has perished. Okay. And it may bring some solace to some folks, but again, it's going to send the message. And maybe some people will heed that message and others will not. But there's no silver bullet for anything. Any response to anything that you do is not going to be clean.
Yeah. Well, it's, a lot of people like to go in there and play Monday morning quarterback after something like that.
Yeah.
And, I remember one of the times I went to Belize, I was in country for 28 days. And one of the guys that we worked with was a guy named Moody. They called them all by their last names. He had 16 kids. And he had 14 that were surviving when I was there last time. And one of them actually ended up getting kidnapped by sex traffickers and sold to one of the brothels over there, because that's still super real. And so, the prepper fiction stuff, it's interesting when you look at it from the standpoint of, this is, these are the realities that we're talking about. This is the seriousness of the subject that we're talking about. When I mentioned that, father that has had to tell his family nothing is for dinner for 3 days, that guy's dangerous. And if there's 1,000 guys like that running around, then you've got a big problem on your hands, because there's nothing worse for him than going home and saying nothing is for dinner again.
Right. And if you're all in the same place, you're all going to cross paths in one way or another, all with the same issue. And then sometimes it's luck, sometimes it's just pure skill or survival of the fittest of who's going to come out on top. I mean, like anything in history, it's all about resources. And, that's how all wars, no matter how they are sold, all wars come down to economics/resources and the battle for them. Yeah. And it'll be no different in the apocalypse. It'll probably be worse. It'll be on a more direct individual level versus the giant geopolitical level that we have, say, now and it's been in the past. Because it's a dad versus another dad. One-on-one in the streets of Orlando, say, for example, versus a bunch of, Marines and Army guys being sent over to Russia or to France to fight some, war because some political guys, or some rich guys or combination of both want something or want control of something. And then we're all paying that price for it. So prepper fiction does, bring some light touches to the realities, okay, of what we've seen in the past in conflict and what an apocalypse would look like, There seems to be another segment. Sometimes it's part of, maybe not the beginning of a prepper fiction book or series, but maybe becomes another component of it, is like Civil War. portion.
Mhm.
That's again another fantasy that we in society, especially today, are really engulfed about on both sides. We say
Yep.
it. Yeah, civil war is going to break out. We're saying it, and like we believe it, but I think most people really don't believe it. Okay, or understand it. So I guess I want to really choose my words right here. Say that what they think of what civil war would be like versus what it actually would be. And I don't even think civil war that our country fought, okay, will even be close to what we would experience if something tragic like that happened in this country.
Well, civil wars tend to become exponentially worse the more factions that you have.
Mhm.
And I mean, just turn on the TV during the news hour or watch one of the 24-hour news channels and, looking at that and going, how many factions can I see in 30 minutes?
Yeah.
And realize that there's a bunch that they're probably not talking about, so I remember when we were doing some battle tracking stuff for during some of the Antifa protests, and it was interesting to me to learn that they had 31 different groups that were factions within Antifa.
Mhm.
They would all have different identifiers and different goals. Um, some of them might have been anarcho-communists. Some of them might have been, people that base their identity about where they fell on the LGBTQ EIEIO spectrum. But they're all working together towards a common goal. But then you start seeing, them fight each other.
Yes.
The minute that they get a little bit of power, they have the
Oh, yeah.
Chads or the Chad get occupied. The guy that started that was put in front of one of those tribunals for sex crimes within 24 hours of them declaring that they were seceding from the United States, essentially.
Look at that. How convenient was that, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that they had a black rap music guy was actually in charge of it when they ended up, bringing everybody out of there.
Only disbanded it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, like many, organizations, especially on the anarchist, leftist side of it, they start to eat their own.
Yeah.
And I think probably more people within those groups believe, that they're all kumbaya and this can work. Where I think if you had a patchwork of people on the other side of the coin, they'll be more guarded about it.
Yeah.
They'll work together for the common goal, but they're all expecting. And I think that's one of the differences. They're all expecting sooner or later someone's going to make a move.
Yeah.
Where the people on the left, a lot more of them were believing, oh, this could work. I can't believe you're doing that.
Yeah. It's like, everybody just keeps on doing the same stuff on a different day.
Yeah.
Thinking, no, it'll work this time. Like when Pol Pot, had that planned famine and ended up killing all those people. Like he just didn't do communism right. So it's like
every time, every failure of communism, they keep saying, oh, but we're going to do it differently.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They say that after every financial crisis as well. So
yeah. Well, the problem is that we don't print enough money, so we got to print more next time.
Yeah.
Never mind that whole inflation thing. That never happens. Almost never.
Yeah.
Well, it happens every time, but let's not dwell on the negatives here.
Yeah, that's just propaganda.
Yeah.
An interesting thing to me is that prepper fictions in the book form. Obviously, any book is generally the book is the original concept of fiction. It has more detail. It's grander in scale. And then when a movie comes, they kind of take the idea of it and they shape it into something that's more concise, and they change things that are different. I mean, that they want different.
Mhm.
So the books seem to be more authentic, but not as entertaining sometimes as shows or movies. But I always find it interesting to watch movies and shows to see uh, how different they are. I mean, I remember watching this one show, which most people probably have never heard of, and I think it's called Our Daily Bread.
Mhm.
And it was produced by a company similar to the people that did Homestead, that
Mhm.
movie. They do a lot of the,
Angel
Christian.
Studios or whatever it was.
Yeah, yeah. So they're
Yeah.
like Angel Studios, but I think they're a different studio.
Mhm.
And so I watched the series, and now to me, it was kind of like almost a B rated. Like you watch movies
Yeah.
on Prime or Netflix, they're a little cheesy, sort of. They're just,
Mhm.
um, but so our daily bread had uh, a more diverse group of individuals, as characters.
Yeah.
Okay, which I think is a good idea. Um, and but they didn't do as good of a job with the various characters of like The Last of Us on HBO.
Yeah.
So where they had Frank and Bill, you had the prepper guy, and
Yeah.
then the other guy. So I mean, I thought that was that was well done for that for that show. Um, but our daily bread had like it was mostly
Reorg.
younger people, more like millennials,
Mhm.
and a lot of the stereotypes in within the millennial genre. But I enjoyed it, and I wish they were able to do more seasons because I think they could have evolved it even more
Mhm.
and probably had a better second season than a first season. Um, but I don't think they were able to get the funding for it, and but I do like the fact that they did take a chance with it, which is kind of part of the premise of Two Guys Making Tribe,
Yeah.
because Gen X meeting Gen Y. There's so many people in the millennial generation that could do well from being a part of a community. I mean, a lot of them are community focused already. There's a lot of similarities between what the millennials feel about certain things and then what people in the preparedness community feel.
Yeah.
Okay. There are differences as well. Okay. But like anything, I think people should focus on where they can bring things together versus focusing on what sets them apart, especially in such a divisive time, in our society,
Yeah.
which this will segue us to our next segment. Okay.
Smooth with the transitions there, Dominic.
Yeah. Of, mutual aid versus mutual assistance. Now, you and
Mhm.
we swim in the pool of various forms of mutual assistance, and they'll use vernacular of MAGs, mutual aid group, or teams, or tribes,
Yeah.
whatever the case may be. And it comes down to being self-sustainable, self-sufficient, grow your own food, don't eat the toxic stuff in the grocery stores, learn how to preserve your food, scratch kitchen, long-term pantry. A lot of these things I've just brought up are a lot of the things that the millennials with their Whole Foods and Sprouts and eating organic, we share the same values in some of those things. So I hope in the future I'm able to bridge that gap. But until then, I thought it was important that we try to understand, what is something similar. I wouldn't say our equivalent, but something similar to mutual assistance groups that
Mhm.
we swim in on the other side of the aisle, and that would be mutual aid. And you and I spoke a little bit prior to the show about, some of the similarities, some of the differences. So I wanted to see what are your some initial thoughts on that?
It's interesting because what they talked about for the mutual assistance approach to building a community or accessing a community, and you and I had talked about how ideologically focused it is. It's written by an anarcho-communist, very obviously, and he's basically talking about doing handouts to get people to listen to the message. And while I might have a personal distaste for communism in every form I've ever found it in, I recognize that methodology was also the one that I used as a missionary.
Yeah.
It's also the one that I did when I was working in my church. It's also, the methodology that every revolution has learned. If you have somebody that you're trying to teach something and you take care of their basic needs, they're a lot more receptive to anything that you have to say.
Yes, definitely. One of the challenges. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Well, it just, it's so normal because it works.
Yeah.
So.
One of the challenges that I face, getting people to connect in the community, to take the chance to meet other people, kind of get to know each other, help each other out, share knowledge, mentor. Those are some of the same challenges that they face in mutual aid community.
Mm-hmm.
So I totally understand that. I think one of the, just like we have a pool of people in our community that have different interest areas and different willingnesses to do certain things. The same set, can apply for mutual aid. But I think there's probably a large pool of people that come across videos on TikTok or Googling on the internet or through other people and friends that they find aspects of mutual aid that they like, So in our community, we might sit there and go volunteer at, Salvation Army or at a soup kitchen or what have you. And they'll do something similar in mutual aid, but they take it to a sidestep as well, where in some communities they'll sit there and put a fridge out in an area, and people will come and bring fresh, fruits and vegetables, or they'll bring prepackaged, say, tubs of food from Publix and pop it in the fridge for anyone to come and get, or boxes of cereal on the shelf.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's not something I've come across in our communities and the people I've interacted with. But I know when we focus more on helping people, whether it's disaster relief, okay, whether it's on a personal level, something happens, someone's house gets hit by a tornado or burns down, people come together and help those people out. But we don't go into communities and just drop off groceries to whoever. It's more personable in the sense that we'll go to your house and bring you groceries.
Yeah.
I remember last year when I was helping coordinate people to get resources after Milton, there was one lady that I connected to on Facebook, never met her before. Someone referred her to me or vice versa. And she was making food and bringing them to people and bringing them to first responders and all the guys for the utility trucks and stuff like that.
Yep.
So that's more in line to what we do in our community versus what they do in mutual aid. So they both have a purpose. They're both good. And, I fault neither,
Yeah. Well, it seems with mutual aid, it's less discriminate, I think, than that kind of individual stuff that you and I are more familiar with.
Right.
Anybody is considered to be a good candidate for having aid dispersed to them as long as they'll listen to the message.
Yeah.
If you don't listen to the message, though, then the aid's not given to you. Whereas I'm more of the line of, used to be aid was dispensed by local community organizations that were actually in relationship with people that were the recipients of that aid.
Yeah.
So if you're local church knows that like things are just rough for you right now and they're rough for your family, that's something that you can go in and be like, okay, you guys are trying, you're doing everything that you can. Here's some food, but we don't want you to, we're not just going to give you money. We're going to give you actual, food that you can eat to feed your kids.
Right.
Whereas I've seen a lot of people over the years that would have aid dispensed to them, and if it was just money, or it was, like I worked in security for a little while. I was an unarmed security guard in a Section 8 housing complex.
Oh boy!
On the east end of an area called Suitcase City in
I know it,
in Tampa. Yeah, so I was just off of Orient Road, north of Hillsborough. Just a great place. And but I remember going over there, and people would abuse the aid that they were given so much, because it didn't mean anything to them.
Yeah.
They would happily have, we called him the ice cream man, because every, the 1st and the 15th, when everybody got their checks in, you'd see these big drug dealers' cars come in, and they'd always be blaring the stereo system. And it was calling all the people that were on drugs or, wanted to swap out for their food stamps for cash. And they take up to a 70 cent on the dollar hit, which means that they're just getting 30 cents, but you can't go to, the liquor store and buy a bottle of whiskey or cognac with, a food stamp card. And, that's always been the concerning thing to me with something like mutual aid, because if you don't have a relationship with the person that you're dispensing the aid to, then you don't know if that can be better put somewhere else, if they're just, pulling a con on you. A lot of the stuff I've had, other of my friends, I never went to Africa, but they ended up, my friends that did as missionaries, a lot of times the local warlords would take their stuff and then they dispense it as they saw fit. Mm-hmm. So the warlord and his bodyguards eat first, right? And then, like, if they're fighting a specific ethnic group, they're going to, oh no, they don't need any medical gear. They don't need any food. Or they'd sell it to people at a markup. And you'd always have those guys, oh yeah, I can help you, and I mean, some of them, they would have a dispensing station over there, and they'd find out that their local guide that was super helpful was actually charging everybody for their place in that line.
Yeah, that's when we end up having to send the Marines in, like we've seen in the past, to make sure the food can get to the people.
Mm-hmm.
Black Hawk Down.
Yeah,
that's an example right there. It wasn't the Marines in that storyline, but it's all kind of in the same theater.
That was America's Skull Stompers, the Army Rangers.
Yeah. And this is one of the challenges with, when the government is involved in providing assistance, okay, it's like giving a block grant. The personalization is taken out of it. And if you don't have that connection with the community, this is where a mutual aid premise could be beneficial versus just cutting checks to everybody.
Yeah.
And in one sense, it's like, oh, it's capitalism. Let them spend it where they want it, but then they spend it on what it's not intended for. And this is one of the challenges I have with mutual aid, is that they don't want any restrictions. Okay, my interpretation of of people getting this. If they're hungry, you give them food. If they need housing, you give them housing.
Yep.
Et cetera, et cetera. And
you might say something like from each according to his ability to each according to his need.
Yeah.
Which is, a
Atlas
direct
Shrugged
quote
right
from well, that's actually a direct quote from Karl Marx's nice little book that gave us communism.
Oh, well, it sounds like what they were saying in the factory in Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah.
That, set off John Galt.
Yep.
But the thing is, it's like, on one hand, yes, you want to feed people. You want to give them health care. You want to give them shelter. Okay. And then one of the issues that the author of Mutual Aid had was the charity model and the nonprofits, which are kind of extensions of the government in a sense, and providing restrictions and criteria, or even the church. So you got to have a certain moral foundation or scope to get their charity. And he mentioned specifically in the book about some tech company made an app that let people pick the attributes of how their money was spent. And he said that was wrong. But I challenge that, because if I'm giving you the stuff that I have a right to sit there and have some influence of how it's being used. So I don't want to give you $20 because, you're hungry, and then you go buy a bottle of Mad Dog 2020. Now, I'm using a stereotype example here. Okay. Now, how picky is someone going to be? You give them $20, do they not go buy fresh fruits and vegetables, but they go buy a sub, or they go buy, a bunch of snack cakes and ice cream? Yeah, those desserts are not healthy. Okay. But maybe those people have enough food that they're eating and they haven't had a snack in a while, and they'll suffice with that, But I mean, you got to find some balance, and if the government has systems in place that are not effective and they feel are being discriminatory, okay, you got to change the systems. But to change the systems, you got to get everybody on board. So, which creates a conundrum, because people don't like change. If they take change, they want it in granular bits, okay, where it doesn't impact them. Okay. But for real change to occur in pretty much anything in society, it has to be radical and bold, and disruptive. But that means a lot of people lose. So you can't sell helping other people when you're making the people that are giving give more than they want to give. Okay. And then, you don't want to sit there, and this is a problem with subsidized housing. Okay. We need, what's the word they use? Affordable housing. Well, that's a relative term. Okay. Now, if you're sitting there making cookie cutter box apartments like Soviet style, okay, so everyone has a shelter. Okay, well, then you're going to have to make X amount. Well, this is for a family of 2, a family of 3 or 4, and you have to build all these different things. But it also costs money to maintain. But now if you're giving this to them, they have no incentive to maintain it, because odds are they're not making a lot of money if they live there in the first place, if they're making any at all. So it's not theirs per se, But then you can't take the capitalistic way of, okay, hey, people with money make affordable housing. Well, how can it be how can I make money if it's affordable? Affordable is one of those relative terms. It's different for everybody, depending on the lens you're looking at. And so if it costs $100,000 to build a house, okay, but someone can't afford to pay the rent on a $100,000 house, but then they can afford to pay the rent on a $50,000 house. Well, then who's going to pay the other $50,000? Well, the government does. Yeah. But then that's coming from the tax rolls. So it's like, You're just rearranging all the Legos in the box. Now, there is economic disparity in the world. I mean, this is all going on a tangent here. But it's important that we even mention these things because in the scheme of mutual aid versus mutual assistance is like, hey, I choose how I'm going to help you. Okay. And I hope to develop a relationship with you. Okay. So we can help each other, whether it's skill sharing or I get into a situation where I need help. Okay. And many of my friends, we've, all helped each other after hurricanes or other personal tragedies and stuff like that, where they say they want to do that in mutual aid, but you're emphasizing redistribution of wealth.
Yep.
So I can help you, but not give you all my stuff or cut it down the center,
Yeah.
So we're equal. So that's the challenge. One of the many challenges I have mutual aid. But like I was telling you earlier, I've read halfway through the book. I'm going to finish, listening to the rest of the book and try to build some connections with people in that community to see where we can come together,
Mm-hmm.
Now, will they be receptive? I don't know. But when I started doing this thing, connecting with people and hosting activities on our side of the fence, people were resistant too. They're resistant to a lot of people to this day. They're worried about being on a list. Everyone's a Fed. Someone wants to know what my stuff is and come take it.
Yep.
So
I remember at one of the earlier groups that I helped with, we had a guy. He was a older guy. He was a farmer out in Dover, and he'd show up to the group, but he wouldn't. He was so paranoid that he wouldn't ever like go training with his guns because then somebody would know that he had guns. But he knew that deep down in his heart that with his little deer rifle that he probably shot 5 rounds in to zero it in at the beginning of every season, he could be just an absolute widowmaker with that. It's like, come on, man. You're not networking with any of the locals. You haven't built rapport with anybody. We are looking at this as this is an opportunity to come in. Every one of those events is an opportunity to share skills and network with people and everything. And if you're not using them to their full potential, you're wasting your time.
yeah.
But 3 years later, he still hadn't made any friends, and it was him and his wife. And I think, like I said, he was probably in his 70s. And I don't see him going well in the crisis.
Yeah.
But I do see him being a fairly high value target, having a farm and no way to defend it, and having livestock and living in a rural area, and
Well, it brings up a good point because I think I've mentioned this to you, and I've mentioned this to other people I've chatted on different podcasts. There is such a large percentage of the preparedness community, okay, that is 60 and above.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, limited income, multiple comorbidities. Just God, some of the stories I hear about people, and I'm taking care of my disabled son, and I'm on disability, and I got this disease and that ailment, and don't have a lot of money to prepare. And depending on the lens you look at the preparedness community, if you're that lone wolf or that tactical guy, you're just like, oh, nope, I want nothing to do with them.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the mutual aid side, to me, that fits the definition of a vulnerable community or aspect of the community, vulnerable person. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, one of the things that, as mutual assistance groups and mutual aid groups, they intertwine. They need to come together with some common, understandings of what each person is referring to the other. On a mutual aid, if they're feeling that people with gender identity issues or, trans or whatever are vulnerable communities, that does not fit the same definition, okay, as vulnerable communities as I would look at, or a lot of people in this space.
Yeah.
And it's not even anything about whether about trans or gender. Okay. To me, it's about, are you physically able? Are you mentally able? I mean, do you have a disease? Okay. Do you have, can you do anything? So if you're a tactical guy and that's your focus, you want someone that can shoot, move, and communicate.
Yeah.
Okay. Your gender identity or your trans identity has nothing to do with your ability to do those things. Okay. So if you can do those things, that's a positive. Okay. And your trans and gender stuff is secondary. Now, it may be important to the people on the mutual aid side and to those individual people, but to find common connection, can you shoot, move, and communicate? Then a tactical cool guy is going to be like, okay. Now, if they have issues with that other stuff for ideological reasons, that's a different story.
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of people that that know the old ways. They're grandmas and grandpas now. They grew up, they were hunting and dressing animals and canning, preserving food. They were living without electricity for the most part, okay? Or were better adapting to be without it. Now, those people have skill, knowledge and skill sets, but they can't shoot, move, or communicate.
Yeah.
They are a vulnerable community, but they still can have value. They can still sit on the porch with a pair of binos and look out for those marauders, okay? And or keep an eye on the children because the children are in earshot,
Yep.
So in our, for me, I try to find value in people regardless of, what their capabilities are. Like, let me reframe that. Regardless if they can fulfill, okay, a lot of capabilities, okay? But if they have some capabilities, I want to find a value in those and, help them be a part of the community.
Yeah, I agree. I think prepping tends to gather people that do have a lot of those, health issues that you mentioned and, age issues and everything. And they kind of have it rubbed in their face on a daily basis that, they're vulnerable. You can't do this alone. You're going to end up needing to have some help taking care of, just yourself. Nevertheless, taking care of somebody else. I think it was you that said, you had a buddy that said, if I don't like you on a Tuesday, I probably won't like you after the poop hits the fan.
Yeah.
And, that's, for me, I'm more concerned about the ethical and moral fiber of somebody than I am their political ideology and whether or not it gels with mine. Because when we're talking about the type of situation that we're going into in something like this is, we have the most important goal, and it's keeping my family alive and, not just surviving, but thriving.
Yep.
And then after that, everything else, is just a relatively minor detail to me. And I think that's what mutual aid realizes is that if you help people deal with the basics of Maslow's hierarchy, you're going to get access to people that you never would have had access to otherwise.
Right.
And, so you have all these people that have, health concerns, and if they're, a trans person that's gone under the gender reassignment surgery, they're going to have some unique health issues, but, they're looking at it from a kind of almost like a communist perspective of, we just need bodies. We need numbers, right? So let's get them in here, regardless of if they're, they're the kid that got picked last for kickball every time in their life. If they're another voice to add to the revolution, then they're ideal to give these handouts to.
Yeah, and if they're eager and they got the energy, then their capabilities increase of what they potentially could do. Just think of, and regardless of what side of the fence, you got young people that are disenfranchised. I mean, this is like every generation, and they're just drifting, getting into shenanigans until they find some inspiration. Sometimes that's a mentor that they connect with, a coach, a teacher, a guy down the shop, the guy that owns the corner store and he gave you a job sweeping the floors, or you had an experience in your life and then you had a different view of thinking things. You make that connection. You want to harness that energy and that effort. And a lot of the participants in mutual aid are young. Okay. Yeah. And there's good reason for it in the sense that, all change comes from the young. Their job is to push back on what was. Okay. Whether it's in music and clothes or art, it happens every generation. We rebel. We rebelled when we were younger. We didn't like the music that our parents liked. We didn't want to do the way our parents did. We want something fresh and new. And as we get older, we want things more status quo. And we make fun of the young people and their new crazy music. It's the same thing like our parents did to us. It's a cycle that repeats itself. It's not something unique in the sense that it only happens to, Gen X or Gen Y to millennials or Gen Z. It's just every generation it happens. That's how change comes about.
Yeah. Well, of course, I mean, the older generation is the one that's usually created the world that they're living in. So if you've worked to create it, why would you want to change it?
Right.
It's your life's work.
All right. And you're the older folks, the ones with the wealth and the stuff.
Yeah. You've had a lifetime to accrue it, to work on it.
Yeah.
A lot of times you've had opportunities that may not have been available yet to that generation. We know that with the Florida real estate market. Yep. I'm living in a house that I bought for $185,000, and it sold on foreclosure. Before that, an old man lived in it. It's a 100-year-old house, and it sold for $40,000. But a lot of my friends, if they didn't buy a house before 2020, it's going to be a while.
Yeah,
and it's sad to an extent because the younger generation gets impatient.
Yeah,
and there tends to be that resentment in somebody that's looking at a lot of these problems, and they're saying, okay, well, I deserve this. Why? Well, everybody has a right to housing. Okay, why? What gives them that right to housing?
Right.
And then who do we decide, whose right is greater? Is my right to housing greater than a single mom's with 10 kids? And if she doesn't have housing, she's going to have to sleep on the street.
Yeah.
So that's really where I start seeing a lot of this stuff, you drill down past the superficial similarities with some of these people, and you start looking at this bigger picture stuff, and you really start to kind of wonder, hey, is this are these people that I can work with,
Yeah.
long term, or even short term?
Right.
If I hook up with one of these mutual aid people and we're in a disaster scenario, and they decided that they wanted to redistribute my stuff because they figured out somebody else needs it more, do I just lay down for that?
Right.
I wouldn't do that, And I mean, if this is what I've got to feed my daughter, I don't think anybody would expect me to lay down for that.
Right. And if they're going to come from, if the mindset of mutual aid, okay, not the people,
Mm-hmm.
but the mindset of the aid, the way their system, they're building it, is just to take the stuff and just give it all away, okay, without a rhyme or a reason, then that's not even efficient. There's got to be some, you may have to ration things out. There's only X amount. This is where a disconnect comes with mutual aid, is that it was never said where the stuff was coming from when they wanted to do things. Okay. Yep. And, they'll sit there and I'm sure some point in the book, I heard the word hoarding at one point. I don't know if they'll go a little bit more in depth, but, the common thing is that people in preparedness are hoarders and they got all this stuff. And then, it's a scary theme that's intertwined in a lot of the prepper fiction where, FEMA or UN Blue Helmet troops are going to come in and want to inventory all your stuff and then take what they need to redistribute to other people or at the camps.
Well, I mean, we watched that happen in North Carolina, right? Local law enforcement was basically stealing generators from NGOs because some little, city guy told them, hey, go get me my stuff. It's like, you have people that are sleeping in a tent tonight in winter.
Yeah.
And you're going to take this so that you can put it in the warehouse so that you can decide who it goes to.
Right. Well, a good example was a good example. Okay. So I think it was Hurricane Maria when it hit Puerto Rico. Okay. I know some guys in my Bible study at the time that I was in, they were through church. There was like two different church. The guys were divided kind of like 50-50. Mm-hmm. Half the guys went to one church and the other half went to another church, and we were all in the same Bible study. We were all friends and stuff. And everybody was getting together to donate stuff. Okay. Brand new supplies, used clothes, brand new socks, underwear, all kinds of stuff. And they were getting shipping containers put together. They could not, find a way to get this stuff to Puerto Rico logistically. Okay. It was too expensive to send it like in packages, and the mail wasn't running anyways. So they were trying to put it in containers, and then they're trying to make arrangements for this stuff to get shipped down there. And it was a logistical nightmare.
Yep.
Okay. So in a lot of the disasters we've experienced in the, say, past 10 years, the outpouring of offerings from people to help other areas, whether it's Puerto Rico or New Orleans or North Carolina, is tremendous. But then it's just like, how do you get it there? And then, and FEMA doesn't seem to have the infrastructure aligned in a way that it could take all that stuff in an efficient manner, in a timely manner. We saw in North Carolina with Grindstone and other organizations being up there, Samaritan's Purse. There was just so much stuff over there that it was challenging to get it all organized, from the stories I've heard from different people. We had to have private helicopters flying in to help rescue people. Yep. Now, part of that, I think, is that what people's idea of what FEMA is is far from what the reality is. And I'm not even talking about the financial assistance. I mean, FEMA is the big machine that comes in after the roadways are cleared to set up and do paperwork. They're not really a relief agency. I mean, the only organization that we have in the U.S. on the government level that could go in and do stuff in austere areas is the military. Okay, and we use the National Guard from different states and stuff like that. But airborne, Rangers, those guys are all trained to deploy in short periods of time in pretty much any environment. Okay, set up fobs. Okay, clear paths out, build infrastructure. And let the relief, start to come in. I don't think the National Guard is really geared towards that. They do a great job.
That was one of the huge missions that we had when I was with Florida National Guard. I mean, we were always training to go in and distribute supplies to people that needed them. And
I mean it in the sense that they can't parachute in.
Yeah.
So it's like, we have certain, units in the Army. It's like 18 hours, we can be anywhere in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. They parachute in with minimal logistics, set up the airstrip, make it so whether it's the helicopters can come in and the airplanes can come in. We need to apply some of those same things towards disaster relief in our country. It's like, my gosh, man. And then
the bureaucratic turf fights make that an unlikely scenario.
Yeah.
I mean, and look at people that are wanting to be about, being seen to be in the business of helping.
Yeah.
They don't. They're looking for agency glory and agency street cred.
Yeah.
That matters to them a lot more, and sometimes than actually helping people. It's
like a politician going in, doing a helicopter ride around, coming down and handing out whatever to some people in a photo op. That's great. You're showing, I'm not saying not to do it. Okay. It's show you're giving some attention there, but really, structure how our relief efforts can be more effective than they are now. I mean, all you hear people complain about FEMA is that they denied whatever people thought they were going to be eligible for, and they just kind of got in the way and didn't bring in supplies. I mean, if we have to sit, so I mean, to me, FEMA is like an afterthought. We as a community need to be able to be there in place, helping out people for at least the first 72 hours. And to me, I kind of got a new thing. It's like the first 72 and the second 72. The first 72 is the run up, like for a hurricane. That's what I base that on. Help prepping your space. Okay. Nothing loose in the yard, boarding up your house, topping off supplies, whatever, helping your neighbors do the same thing, or preparing to evacuate and going. That's the first 72. Then you got your 24 hours of the storm, and then the 72 hours afterwards, because it's going to take 3 days to really get things spun up. People come out of their shelters and their houses and stuff, and things are down, places are flooded out. It takes time for that water to drain out, for those crews to get out, So I kind of, I'm trying to put my money where my mouth is, in a sense. It's not just complain about, hey, FEMA's not effective. FEMA's role is just different than what it actually can provide. So let's readjust that and let's focus on local community. This is one of the reasons I like Florida State Guard and how that is slowly building up. It doesn't have the breadth and depth, okay, that the National Guard does, okay? But But I do like the idea, and for us to transition to something like that and put resources in it. For a state like Florida, which we have hurricanes every year,
Yeah.
it's a worthy investment in our state funds, you know?
Well, we get to get dress rehearsals on a lot of this stuff, regularly, like you said.
Yeah.
So it's something that we really do get to experience, for better or for worse. I think for a lot of these, if you look at a lot of these groups that we're talking about, mutual aid groups, mutual assistance groups, and you look at these operations that they're going through and doing, it kind of makes sense to treat everything like it's training, and you're getting to test your skill set and what you have going for you, um, against relatively lesser issues. I remember with FEMA, you know, they were taking credit for what the NGOs were doing, and like the NGOs were wanting to make sure that they had that credit because at the end of the day, that's how they get their funding.
Yeah.
So if they can't, if they can't do this anymore because they can't have the funding, then that's a problem for them, and it all goes away.
Yeah. Well, I think your average person doesn't understand how reimbursements on a government level happen. I mean, when I took my CERT training last summer with the city of Tampa, I got a little introduction to how that works. And basically, it works from the bottom up. So say use city of Tampa, for example, they document everything. Everything that they do, everything that they supplied, and then they submit all those reports, okay, to follow procedures to be in line with, emergency operations, but also to get reimbursement. I mean, down to the volunteer hours, okay, and the training hours that we put in. So they apply for reimbursement to the state, and the state takes all that stuff from all the other city or to the county, and then the county to the state. So it just flows upstream, and then the state turns to FEMA, okay, for reimbursement. And then what does FEMA do? Then FEMA goes and asks for more funding to, whether it's to cover what they incurred this year versus, and then for next year and what have you. So, and that all takes time, So you still got to fund, you got to stage all kinds of stuff, which like the city of Tampa does, so does Hillsborough County and the state. I think they do a pretty good job with it all. But they got to front all that money and pay all those vendors. And then they got to, account for it and report it. And then they got to project for the following year too. So now if that money is guaranteed to be put back down, then that's great. But what if FEMA decides to say, well, we're not going to reimburse you for that, state of Florida? And state of Florida says, okay, well, Hillsborough County, we're not going to reimburse you for that. Okay, well, city of Tampa, we're not going to reimburse you for that. Now, city of Tampa is like, oh, what's going on here? That's my interpretation of, I think, how it works. I don't want anybody saying, hey, the city of Tampa does it this way, according to Dominic from Two Guys Making Tribe. It is my interpretation of how it operates.
It's probably pretty close to the truth.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember there's also some screw around stuff that goes on. I've got a couple of friends in Georgia. Had one of the things that they were doing, they brought in the whole department that my buddy's a sheriff's deputy with, and they had them sitting up there pulling an overtime check during Milton because they knew that all these guys were going to have to go in and after Milton or Helene rather than Milton, they'd be having to cut through the roads. so that the fire departments could get to the people to extract them from where they actually needed to go, And he's like, the county administrator has a little bit of a pucker factor going on right now because we don't know if we're going to get this money back. And, you put 40 cops in a room and let them pull OT. That's a chunk of change.
Oh, yeah. A lot of those guys, they live off that OT to make things happen. All the extra duty and stuff like that.
Yep.
With all these different organizations and the way they things operate, I think it's important that we sit there and create our own subsystems, either modeled off some of this stuff, even if we're not directly affiliated and what have you. So I don't know if I mentioned this to you before, but, I'm a believer in CERT, and I did all the things and, but CERT is big, it's vast, and it covers the city of Tampa, which is geographically divided. One half is the center of, Hillsborough County, and then you have that big section up in New Tampa, up to the Wesley Chapel, to the county line. Neither one are in my neighborhood, and none of those first responders and what have you. But for me, one of the reasons I went to CERT is I wanted to be able to give back, and I wanted to learn to see if there's something different that they were providing that, or something that they provided that I could implement on a local level or a variation of it. So I derived, an acronym from CERT, called it NERT. So CERT is Community Emergency Response Team. So then I created NERT, Network Emergency Responder Team. I purposely didn't say response because I want to emphasize responder, because something that we're emphasized in the preparedness space is you are your own first responder, whether it's security, medical, whatever the case may be. So I put a little spin on it there, where I live in a subdivision. I think it's our duty as people in our neighborhoods is that we lead other people when a crisis happens. So a car accident occurs, we're driving down the road. I think it's our duty to pull over and see if we can assist. It can make a difference. That person's car could be on fire. And if you don't go pull them out, they're definitely going to die. Now, some people might not want that responsibility. Understandable. Or they may feel that it's not their duty. But as a good citizen, we should try to help when we can. I'm not saying throw yourself in danger, per se, or risk your children's lives so you can help some other stranger. But if you can do something, then do it. I mean, if it means just keeping someone calm in the car while first responders are on their way. It could take minutes. It could take 10 minutes before an ambulance can get there. And that person's panicking. And you can make all the difference. Or you could slap a tourniquet on or put pressure on a wound or whatever the case may be. So I use as an example, we don't have to be so dramatic in our neighborhoods, but we can sit there and do the 72 and 72. We could help our neighbors. We could say, hey, guys, storm's coming up. I'm going to be putting some stuff away. Is there anything I can help you with? Or, hey, I'm doing these things. I need a hand. If you can help me with this, I can help you with something in your yard as well. Talk to our neighbors and stuff. And that's just in normal stuff that happens. And we can't always rely on calling 911 and them to come and save the day. And one of the things in mutual aid is they want people to be able to help each other because response times are very long or non-reactive. Now we see this in the movies and stuff like that. Law enforcement or fire departments don't want to go into certain neighborhoods, or they take a long time. There could be a variety of reasons for that. It could be fact, it could be fiction. But irregardless, whether you live in a neighborhood that doesn't get first responder stuff in the right amount of time, whether you're in an urban area or if you're in a rural area where it's 40 minutes away from the hospital, then it behooves you guys to be basic medics.
Yeah.
I'm not saying be a paramedic, but man, be a point where you can just stop the bleed, put a tourniquet on, cover the wound, stop them from choking, what have you. Know your first aid and CPR and a little bit more.
Yeah.
What do you think? What do you think on that?
No, I agree, and that's that's something. That's where I see with the mutual aid stuff. The mutual assistance stuff from our perspective. It's about increasing your own self-reliance so that you're able to help others. Because if you don't have any skill sets, then you're nothing more than another liability to be managed.
Yeah.
And it sucks to put it in those raw terms because nobody likes to hear, "Hey, dude, you're a burden."
Yeah.
But it is something that it's kind of like the question of what you do with it at that point.
Yeah.
I take a medical class every year, at least one, but it's a trauma-based class taught by my buddy Franklin Riddle. And, we do stop the bleed stuff. We do tourniquets. We look at, what the best practices are according to whatever TCCC may have changed on guidelines. And that keeps those skills current. And it's not, it's a fun class because he's a good instructor, but I've heard most of the material before. But it's my belief that if I ever need those skills, I want the training that I have on them to be fresh.
Yeah.
And, it's something that's just as useful as learning what to do in a situation where those medical skills are used. It's also learning what not to do. That's vital. I remember a couple of years ago, I was at a barbecue with my family, and I was trying to put my daughter down for a nap. She was, I think she was right around 1 at that point. My mother-in-law came charging in the room that I was in, ripped open the door, and like most parents, I was a little annoyed because I'm trying to get this kid to sleep, man. But she said, your this family friend of ours is he's on the ground. I need you to come give him CPR. He passed out. And so I went out there, and the first thing I told his wife, she was freaking out. I was like, "You're a saint," because he's snoring really loudly. This is what you slept next to for the last 30 years. you're definitely a saint. But I said, he doesn't need CPR. They're like, what? Well, he passed out. You perform CPR when somebody passes out. I was like, you perform CPR when somebody's not breathing.
Yeah.
And if he's snoring, it sounds gross, but he's still breathing. If I do CPR and I take 230 something pounds of hairy knuckled redneck and I start bouncing it on his sternum, whatever medical issues that he had that made him pass out, we're going to add broken ribs to that.
Yeah.
So this is when intervention will actually hurt, both literally and figuratively. But that's where having those skill sets, keeping them recent, and relevant, and then you can go do all your tactical training or whatever it is about prepping that blows wind up your skirt. I have some of my friends are huge about food prep, and that's all they do is they stockpile. Well, I wish you'd take a rifle class every once in a while. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wish you'd go to a medical class every once in a while. I wish you get your ham license. But that's kind of, I guess, the personal discipline of becoming a well-rounded, self-reliant person is, will you hold your nose and do things that you don't like to do because they're necessary?
Yeah.
I'm not a huge guy on ham radio. I don't enjoy studying it. A lot of the people that I've met through it are nice way to put this. People I struggle to find common ground with. But communications is a vital capability, and if you don't have it, you're screwed.
Yeah. And, with communications, you kind of got to, I've developed a philosophy that you need to be where, kind of paraphrasing the saying, but go to where people are versus trying to make them come to you, in a sense. So find some form of the communications that it's something versus nothing, and, GMRS is the way to go, because you can use that in your house, around your house, on your property, in a little convoy of cars, and that'll cover most communications for most people. And it gets them in the door. I mean, a lot of times, if you don't get them in the door to do something, then they'll never have the opportunity. Not the opportunity. They'll never find the desire to go above it. So get them started. So want someone to put food back? Well, convince them to do 2 weeks. If we get them to do 2 weeks, man, that's a big thing. They're like, oh, okay, well, I got this baseline here. Let me just add a little bit more, And then it depends on what they're putting back, and how they're putting it back. It'd be great to have all kinds of freeze-dried foods. Too expensive to buy all that food. Then, I'll just buy a freeze dryer. And then you got to buy all the food, and then you got to do all the time, the electricity. People aren't going to, not all people are going to put that effort in. It's a barrier to entry, And that's why a lot of people that prepared, you see all these videos, well, go to Dollar Tree or go to Walmart, and you're buying all this processed, cheap box container canned food, and it's easy for people. And nobody really looks at them crazy. Versus learning how to can, go and get all the jars and the lids and the canning and, do all that. People just go the path of least resistance. And I think people that just put back food, their ideology is just like, well, I don't have to leave my house. They just think shutting their door and they'll wait till the crazy is over and they got the food, they'll be fine.
Yeah.
They're not really thinking about communicating with anybody outside or securing it or whatever the case may be. And I bet you a lot of these people probably just sit on their porch every night or sit in their recliner every night. They really don't go anywhere other than their grocery store or maybe go to church or run an errand. But they're basically 90% homebodies. Again, it fits in with the older people. That's what they do. So they just prepare for their greatest fear, and their greatest fear is like being hungry. So they can solve that in their mind by just stacking all these cans and boxes of food. And then all the other fears are really, that won't happen.
Yeah. Well, I remember that was one of the smart little intros that we had in one of the survival groups that I was helping run was, everybody seemed to have their pet apocalypse. And when they would come over and they'd be there for the first time, they'd be like full to overflowing because they didn't have anybody to talk about this stuff with that was receptive, that wouldn't call them crazy. They'd feel weird, or they wouldn't have anything to contribute to the discussion in a positive manner. So I had this buddy of mine, he would tell everybody the same thing. We've got some new faces in here, so we're just going to go around and, have everybody introduce themselves. First names, are fine. And then, take about 30 seconds and let us know what you're preparing for, and how long you've been in preparedness. But keep it to 30 seconds. We've got a lot of stuff to go through. And it was always interesting to see the generational differences in what people were concerned about. For people in my generation, it was a lot of biological stuff. for stuff, in the baby boomers that we would have come in, it was a lot of concerns about usually about nuclear stuff. That's what they grew up with the Cuban Missile Crisis and everything. Gen Xers were always worried about EMP stuff. When somebody had told them that coronal mass ejection could be just as bad as somebody detonating an EMP in high altitude. But what I found was that like the skill sets that you would use to deal with any of this stuff was always the same.
Yep.
You still need to worry about food and water and shelter. And then although Maslow considered those the base of the pyramid, I added the fourth one of security. Because if you can't keep your food, water, and shelter, then it's not really yours, and that need isn't met. So
you're just storage until the marauder comes.
Yeah, well, like my nephews, they're young, they're Generation Z. They call them loot drops or loot crates. Yeah, they'll look at these people and they say, well, they're just a supply dump.
Yeah.
And it's based off of they're playing online games.
Yeah.
So I thought it was pretty interesting.
These are all my hidden caches, and I didn't have to put any of them together.
Yeah, I inherited them.
Yeah.
through the usual way.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up now. I think tonight was a great conversation.
Absolutely. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. And I look forward to our next iteration of an episode coming up soon. Hopefully we'll be able to get Brendan in there as well from a remote location. If there's one thing I'd like everyone to learn from tonight is that mutual assistance groups and mutual aid groups are out there. They have commonalities, and I would encourage everyone to sit there and try to find those commonalities and make connections. And if you happen to come across this video out in the world and you're into mutual aid, have some experience with it, please feel free to comment or even reach out to me. And we could chat more about it. Even though I have some differences with some of the structures of mutual aid, I do like the premise in helping people. So anything that helps people, I like to give a good listen and see what I can learn from it and maybe even contribute to it. Any final words, Aaron?
I think you pretty well summed it up. I enjoyed the conversation, and can't wait to do the next episode. So we'll see what we get up to talking at that point. I would say alongside of that, even if you decide not to join a mutual aid group or a mutual assistance group or start one, being aware of the nomenclature by what these people refer to things as is really valuable, because then you can kind of figure out what their worldview is and where they're how they're approaching a problem. So if you keep up with people that are radical communists and how they speak about things, hearing some of those key words, you're like, aha! You said mutual aid, not mutual assistance. Are you what's your approach on that? And you can kind of know who you're dealing with a little bit better.
Oh yeah, and just because someone likes to participate in mutual aid does not believe that does not mean they believe in all the ideological constructs of it. And the same can be said about mutual assistance groups.
Yeah.
Okay. It is not a bunch of right wingers and Nazis and all kinds of crazy nomenclature that they like to give. So it's a lot of average people just trying to, prepare for any kind of emergency and help other people in the process. Okay. So I think I know the crime and ground. we can all help each other. I thank everyone for watching. Aaron, I thank you again for filling in. Look forward to our next episode. And everyone, please remember to like and subscribe and share this video with other people so we can grow this community and keep putting out these episodes and making them better each time. Until next time, everyone, have a good night.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. Now, please remember to like and subscribe and share with your friends. We will see you next time.